Thank you very much, Oles, for that generous introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here, albeit virtually. So yes, indeed, I'm Rogier Creemers. I work here at the University of Leiden as an assistant professor in the law and governance of China, and I mostly focus on the Chinese technology sphere. And I think it's safe to say that there are a whole number of things that have happened there over the last 2 years. And sometimes we call them China's great tech crackdown. And the event that's usually taken as a starting point for that is a moment in the autumn of 2020, where the initial public offering, the IPO of Ant Group, which used to be the financial arm of Alibaba, China's big e-commerce platform company, was suddenly cancelled. And it was cancelled a couple of days after Jack Ma, the well-known founder of the whole Alibaba ecosystem, gave a speech in Shanghai where he heavily criticized regulators. And so, you know, this was very much seen as, you criticize us, we'll come back at you. And that was really the first moment where we immediately saw a whole number of regulations coming out on fintech specifically. But then over the subsequent year and a half, what we've seen is a wave of regulations targeting nearly all important aspects of the platform sector, ranging from antitrust and competition law to increased forms of content control, particularly where it relates to novel forms of content presentation or related services such as algorithms or AI-generated content, you know, the deepfakes, for instance, that are so fashionable right now. But also looking into things like data protection, labor protection, and so on and so forth. And obviously we call this the great tech crackdown because we are sort of predisposed whenever we talk about China to think in terms of this is an authoritarian state, and authoritarian states want to crack down on things they don't like. And what I want to argue is that there are in fact two elements of this that are a little bit beside the point. When we call it a tech crackdown, it's not really a crackdown. It's also not about all tech. So this has been very much what I'd like to call a rectification or a regulatory wave, primarily targeting the online services sector and most specifically the large online platforms that have become a daily fixture in the lives of ordinary Chinese citizens. But so most other parts of the tech sector, company software, advanced robotics, pretty much anything hardware, has really not been included. Two, it's not been a crackdown in the sense that very often when we say, you know, we have a crackdown, it's because we want something to stop or to go away. We want to remove something. We want to get rid of something. And a lot of the argumentation that we're getting from the Chinese state is, you know, quite the opposite to that. They don't want to get rid of the platform economy. In fact, there are multiple policy documents that recognize the fact that the platform economy is crucial to China's future economic development plans, and more broadly, its plans to move towards a more sustainable model, not just of economic growth, but also of enhancing social well-being, government efficiency, and all of the other nice things that the Communist Party of China wants. So it's not about getting rid of the platform economy, but it is about, I would argue, regulating the platform economy in such a way that many of the negative externalities that it generates are internalized into the process. And I'm going to make that argument by looking in detail at what's happened, but first give you a little bit of a background on, you know, how China does economic management. Because obviously China is an economy that comes out of a planned Stalinist economy in the late 80s, moves towards marketization, but doesn't necessarily move towards what we would recognize as a liberal market economy. Because for China, the market is never a goal in and of itself. The market is a tool to achieve particular goals, which in the very purpose-oriented political vision of the Communist Party of China is about achieving, you know, very utopian almost political outcomes in the future. And the market can be a useful tool for that. but it means that you need to embed the market in a broader political context. And the way that that happened in the 1990s was that you got a bifurcation of the Chinese economy, where on the one hand, the Chinese central state kept hold of control in a number of sectors, which we can call the strategic commanding heights. And these are things like energy, media, construction, and other similar strategic sectors. And this is where you see that it's still state-owned and state-controlled enterprises that dominate those sectors. The rest of the economy was opened up to private entrepreneurialism, and we saw a gradual pullback of the state there. So essentially, the Chinese leadership made a decision to control fewer things, but to control those strategic elements of the economy that they needed to control those better and more effectively. Now, the problem with the digital industry is that it emerged after this bifurcation occurred. And so it started out as something that was very much private dominated. But it has since, of course, grown into a scale and into activities that are of obvious strategic relevance. And so the question of how do we actually incorporate the digital industry into these pre-existing view of the economy, in particular forms of economic management, as a tool to achieve development aims became a very live one. And the leadership has, for instance, experimented with structures that we know as things like the golden share, where the central government will take a very small stake in those companies, like a 1% shareholding amount, for instance, in order to get more access to information about those companies, but also in order to have influence on policy. We know that the Communist Party has been very active in expanding into those companies as well. But what we've also seen more at the macro level is a shift in the way that the Chinese leadership looks at the stage of development that they're in, and the particular goals that they then now need to achieve, because obviously the goals were different when they were one of the poorest countries in the world. There's a new set of challenges, there's a new set of circumstances. And this is what Xi Jinping calls the new era. And the new era is characterized by a sense that China wants to move away from a focus on GDP growth at nearly all costs towards a development model that addresses some of the great imbalances that have emerged during that period where GDP growth at all costs was the main target. And those are regional imbalances. Those are imbalances between the wealthy and the poor. We talk about things like common prosperity. But we also talk about potential development risks, right? There's a lot of attention in China now to what happens when you get financialization in an economy, where the financial sector occupies too much of a share of GDP, because that leads to volatility. And if there's anything that the Chinese government doesn't like, and doesn't want, it is volatility. And so what we've seen is that the macro level political context is also moving away from seeing GDP growth and therefore corporate growth as the single prime goal towards a much broader spectrum of goals, which need to be balanced against each other, that also include particular aspects of social welfare, that also include particular elements where you are going to forego particular forms of GDP growth because you actually believe that they are deleterious to the overall health of the socio-economic ecosystem. And I think that word ecosystem is very important. It is a word that the Chinese government uses a lot, and it tells us something about the way that they look at managing the digital sector. So these are really sort of two background trends that I think are very important in recognizing the suddenly different circumstances in which Chinese platform companies find themselves. On the one hand, the question from the Chinese state, how do we deal with these companies that have become of strategic importance? How do we make them fit within our pre-existing model, or how do we update that model to make that work? And on the other hand, how do these companies and their activities fit into our rapidly shifting political priorities? A more specific element to that is that, like in many other places in the world, in China, we don't like big tech anymore in the way that we used to. And in very many cases for the same reasons, right? These companies are playing fast and loose with user data. These companies are abusing dominant positions in order to make more money for themselves. and so on and so forth. And I'll come back to that. And in fact, it's no coincidence that just a couple of days before this regulatory offensive started, there was a collective study session of the Chinese Politburo that was completely dedicated to the digital economy. So what you really see is the sort of the buildup of a head of steam, where you can't really sort of point towards any given individual event or any given individual occurrence that triggers all of this. But there really was a lot of pressure building up in the system to say, we need to do something about regulating platforms. We saw some early indications of that as well in the 2018 decision to move ahead in legislation for personal information protection, which was by and large targeted at the online economy, as well as the 2019 revision to the consumer protection law, which also already in embryonic form contains a lot of the provisions that we later see so fleshed out as these as these consumer protection regulations come out. And so what we've had since then is pretty much a year and a half of torrential emergence of regulations in all kinds of different fields. And I think it would be going too far here to list them all. I'm working on a paper about this, which I hope to sort of publish in draft form, at least by the end of the month. So do look out for that. But I think we can sort of categorize these measures into 6 different buckets of what they try to do substantively. And I do think that we have to talk about substance. I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of speculation in news media, but also in the sort of the think tank academic sphere about, you know, is this all personal? Is this about Xi Jinping wanting to get one over on Jack Ma? Or is this institutional, right? So one element that we see is we have a new competition regulator in China, the State Administration of Market Regulation. And they're very new. And it seems like they have used this regulatory offensive as an opportunity to really establish themselves and showcase themselves in a bureaucratically competitive landscape in order to gain greater visibility, greater access to money, greater access to other resources. So these political factors are there. But my argument would be that this is, and we shouldn't discount them, but there is also a substantive story here, and you can only do the politics if you have at least something of a substantive narrative in which it makes sense. Because very few people are going to support Xi Jinping just because he wants to get one over. A lot of people who might well want to support particular measures on data protection because it is, for instance, in their interest. So what are these 6 buckets and what is their context? The first, I would argue, is content related. And obviously, this is nothing new. The Chinese government, it's very well known, has been regulating online content pretty much since the internet arrived in China. And so what we see now is we see all kinds of new content related regulations coming out, and they're either general, coming out of the CAC, aimed at new technologies like algorithms or like artificial intelligence generated content. And they very much follow a template that we know already from pre-existing forms of content control. And that is very much, this is about identifiability. You want to know who makes that content. You want to know who uploads it. It's about transparency. You want to see what goes into that content. You want some sort of algorithmic transparency, or you want AI generated context to be labeled. And you want to outsource responsibility for enforcement primarily to the companies. As in, you know, you are primarily responsible for making sure that problems don't happen. And when they do, you are primarily responsible for cleaning up your own mess. Then you've got sort of more specific issues. Some of you may have heard that at some point the Television and Broadcast Administration came out with rules about the depiction the depiction of, you know, boy bands who do not conform to, you know, official to the sort of gender stereotypes that that these administrative institutions like. And so we say, you know, we're not going to have excessive depiction of quote unquote sissy boys on online broadcasting. And a lot of that is again, it's sort of stuff that we see every so often. The Chinese Communist Party is very paternalist, and particularly given the fact that this is a year where we're going to have a party congress, we see increased media content control in the run-up to that. So this is happening. It's very much sort of incremental and evolutionary continuity to what was happening before in content. A second is a lot more innovative, and this is what I call market regulation EU style. And to a very significant degree, in a number of areas, the Chinese government has been very inspired by what the EU does. Data protection, personal information protection law of China is very much inspired by the GDPR, although obviously in a very different political institutional context. Or in other cases, you have parallel evolution, where you have problems in competition regulation in the way in which these platform companies compete with each other or abuse their dominant market positions to impose onerous terms and conditions on users or on third-party merchants that operate on these platforms. And we see similar things happening in the digital markets and services package that is now in the legislative process in Brussels. So what we very clearly see there are cases of parallel evolution where Chinese regulatory authorities have come to very similar conclusion to European regulatory authorities on how to deal with these particular challenges in a comparable way. And the overarching element, what you see here, is that they want to rebalance market power between these platforms and users and third-party merchants through data protection, through antitrust regulation, through competition regulation, but also that they want to make sure that there is interoperability between those platforms, that you have less walled gardens, that you can use the payment system of one platform for purchases on another platform, so you have greater interoperability across these ecosystems. So that's the second bucket. The third bucket is dealing with emerging social issues. And it is very clear that in China, there are a ton of emerging social issues. That is, of course, not strange in a society that is undergoing a transformation as wrenching as the Chinese transformation is and has been for decades. But so here we're talking about issues like labor protection. Obviously, these e-commerce companies and food delivery companies, by now, they're hiring enormous amounts of things like delivery drivers, and their working conditions have been very tough. And so what we're seeing is that now, even labor unions have been mobilized, officially sanctioned by a Chinese state, in order to form a counterweight to that. We've also seen judgments against the 996 labor practices in Chinese tech companies, which means working from 9 in the morning till 9 in the evening, 6 days a week. And so we see labor issues here. But what we also see, for instance, is fertility rates have dropped significantly in China. And that obviously means that the Chinese labor population is shrinking. It means that you've got all of these demographic worries for the future. China's by and large completely gotten rid of the one-child policy. And now they want to encourage Chinese people to have more children. Obviously, that's difficult because it's very expensive to raise a child in China. And so what we see is that one of the moves that the leadership has made is to mandate that the very profitable tutoring, out-of-school tutoring service business had to go non-profit. And obviously, that is a multi-billion industry that you pretty much destroy overnight to send a very clear signal to, people who might or might not be thinking about having a child in China, that the government is thinking about them and the government is trying to make things easier for them in terms of the financial burden of having a child in the China of the present. So that is the third category, emerging social concerns. The fourth is macroeconomic risks. And this is really where we get into fintech territory, where there's a couple of problems happening at the same time. One, you have these fintech platforms that have really evolved from being only payment processors to really offering a range of financial services like lending, like insurance, like wealth management, but in a very unregulated manner. And obviously, as I said, the Chinese government doesn't want unregulated monopolies or oligopolies to be competing in a highly regulated sector, because it means they're always going to be winning out. So what we're seeing in a way is normalization, where you see where what you see is regulation in an existing sector being transferred into their digital manifestation, so that online finance is subject to the same regulatory framework as traditional finance. A second element of that is Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, which again, the Chinese government sees as a vehicle for speculation and therefore volatility, as well as a vehicle for doing illegal things, for expropriating capital by corrupt officials, for buying things that you should not be buying, things like drugs or digital child sex abuse imagery. And it is also bad for the environment. So pretty much China banned cryptocurrency. They did it gradually, from mining to offering, and now all transaction, in a bid, again, to deal with the macroeconomic impact of fintech. And a third element of it relates to taxation. And this relates to also the social concerns, right, about equality, about this whole thing of common prosperity. Deng Xiaoping said, some got rich first. Now the Chinese government is saying, good, a bunch of people got rich first. Now we need to make sure that the rest can do well. And so there have been some very visible tax fraud cases for things like online influencers who are making a lot of money, dodgy tax affairs, and a very clear signal has to be sent that, this should not be a viable business model. If you want to be an influencer, be an influencer, but, we're coming after your taxation. And we're also essentially going to manage the sort of, the business model there, again, in order to decrease financial viability, but also to decrease the idea that, a lot of young Chinese kids want to become influencers rather than become productive members of society. And this idea of productive members of society brings me to the fifth bucket, which is the sort of the broader questions of China's tech development goals. And what China has seen is in the platform economy, there has been this sort of development of a platform economy that has borrowed very much from American examples, but that has also been very much divorced from the real economy. And what China really wants, and this becomes very clear in the 14th five-year plan cycle, which came out in the beginning of this year, is they want to have a much closer integration between the digital sector and the real economy. So what they do not want is for this platform economy to become this economic bubble, which primarily serves to make people like Jack Ma very wealthy. What they also want is to incentivize these companies to reorient investment and business development plans towards greater interaction with traditional products, whether it's smart cars or wearable devices, or modernizing agriculture or modernizing manufacture and making all of that more efficient, increasing productivity and all the rest of it. Or whether it is supporting, which is also something that comes forward very clearly in that 14th five-year planning cycle, whether it's about making government work a lot more efficiently and responsively to citizen needs. So it's really about integrating that platform sector into the rest of the economy, as well as enabling an ecosystem for small and mid-sized enterprises. China is very much looking at Germany, and it wants to be an economy in which the real economy matters a lot, as opposed to what it sees like this Anglo-American speculative economy, primarily based on smoke and mirrors and financial wranglings and all the rest of it. But that also means that you want a thriving SME sector to become a sort of 21st century counterpart to the German Mittelstand, that ecosystem of very small, highly specialized companies in Germany that in very many ways is responsible for a lot of German economic wealth. But then you don't want these very large platform companies to essentially be able to buy up all of these promising startup companies in very many cases so that they don't have to compete with these new technologies and new business models. So if these companies are too large, then that might have a deleterious impact on the development of new technologies through these SMEs. And obviously that's also, China wants to have that thriving ecosystem where you don't want to have the apex predator sort of eating the ecosystem empty, as it were. And the last element of it is enhancing Chinese resilience and limiting exposure to foreign adversaries. And so a lot of what we see is regulation on foreign listing on foreign stock exchanges in the area of data, where if you have particular kind of data in particular quantities, and that's both personal information as well as information that the Chinese government sees to be as of strategic relevance and strategic importance, you can't really export that without undergoing cybersecurity reviews. So a lot of it is about making sure that it's a lot harder for things like American intelligence services to get at Chinese data, which they might then use for nefarious purposes, but also to decrease reliance on essentially US capital markets. Obviously, that's very difficult, and we've seen over the last month or so that the Chinese government has actually been making concessions and compromises in dealing with companies listed on American stock exchanges, where they want to make it easier for these Chinese companies to provide information to US auditors, because the United States has increasingly sought to use its regulatory power over American stock exchanges in order to make these Chinese companies behave in a particular way. So there's American legislation that says, if you can't meet particular auditing criteria, you're going to be delisted. It's very clearly targeted at Chinese companies. And there's a recognition in Beijing that, hey, it's going to do tremendous damage to these businesses that we don't want to see killed if they have to sort of detach from US capital markets all in one go. But so there is an element there about building resilience vis-a-vis foreign adversaries. But this sort of notion of auditing and this Chinese compromise brings me to the whole point, where are we now? And how is this going ahead? And when is this going to stop? Because what we're seeing is that China's tech sector now is doing really, really badly. Share values have tanked across the boards, and often by very, very high percentages. And obviously, there are multiple reasons for that. The emergence of Omicron in China is obviously inflicting a lot of harm on the economy. A lot of these measures are going to really drastically increase the costs of doing business for these companies, because there's obviously going to be an increased compliance cost. Because in essence, what is happening is that the Chinese government is making these companies internalize a lot of the cost of their business models that so far they've been able to palm off onto other stakeholders. So whether it's thousands of content reviewers that they need to hire, or whether it's third-party cybersecurity services providers that they need to retain in order to ensure that they comply with increasingly onerous cybersecurity requirements. This is a major impact on the bottom line of these companies. But also, China is facing very strong macroeconomic headwinds, and so the question is, can you go through with that entire package in all in one go? And we've seen some signals from Liu He, who runs economic policy primarily in the central government, that some of the implementation will be delayed, some of it will be not as bad as initially thought, or certainly, the new rules that have come out, this is pretty much it. There's not going to be more. But obviously, the Chinese digital economy has been doing very poorly. And so there are tremendous incentives tremendous pressure on the Chinese government to essentially loosen up the pressure a little bit. But nevertheless, I do think that we are faced here with a sort of new normal in platform regulation. And it's a new normal that is based on what I call normalization to a very significant degree. And with that, I mean that in China, like in other places in the world, for a very long time, we've seen the tech, we've seen these big tech platforms, we've seen the digital economy as something that was sort of living in its own sphere. And it was immune to the normal laws of regulatory gravity that usually involve relationships between governments, societies, and businesses. And what we're seeing is that, as I gave the example in the financial sector, well, if you're going to do online finance, you're going to be regulated like any other finance company. But also, if you're going to have delivery drivers, they're going to be employees, and you have to treat them like other employees. You cannot claim special status just because you are the glitzy showcase of the economy of tomorrow. So in a whole lot of these spheres, what is essentially happening is that digital platforms are being asked to shoulder the burdens that other companies have had to shoulder for a very long time. Another element of it is indeed just sort of getting to grips with the regulatory needs of a digital economy, in the sense that when you look at the evolution of regulation in something like the car industry, like it's taken us decades to come to the point where actually cars were safe to drive. And here we see similar elements where, where it comes to how can you use personal information protection? Well, we have personal information related safety concerns. And so the obvious regulatory question is, this isn't just about rectifying market failure. It's also about making sure that particular political objectives that don't necessarily automatically get priced into a market economic model, public policy concerns, are met. And so again, it's very much the digital economy being treated like any other sector of the economy, and that's going to be permanent. Now, as I said, there is a particular Chinese context in which we need to see this. But I also think, and with this I'll conclude, I also think that we should be looking at this from very much a comparative perspective, because as I already said, the EU is doing similar things. And the whole notion of normalization, the idea that, we don't like big tech anymore, that's a worldwide phenomenon. And the question, how do we actually internalize the costs of doing business into that model? Whether it's, what burden should Facebook bear in terms of content control in Myanmar, or what burden should Twitter bear for getting rid of the obvious bots on their platform, to the sort of questions that Brussels too is asking in the Digital Markets and Services Acts, and that is already answered to a certain degree in the New Deal for Consumers package that passed a couple of years ago. This whole notion of the great normalization of the digital economy is a global one. And what I would argue is that we're seeing a distinct Chinese manifestation of this, because obviously the constraints and the parameters under which the Chinese digital economy operates are different from Europe, are different from the United States again. So there are distinct Chinese characteristics, but I also think it should make sense to see this as a distinct manifestation, a distinct Chinese manifestation of a global trend, where I'm a China specialist. I don't actually spend a lot of time working on what happens in the EU or the United States, but what I do see is that there's a lot of ground for potentially fruitful comparative research. With this, I would like to conclude. We have a little bit of time left for your questions and answers, which I look forward to hearing.